Migraine Monkey here. Today I'm going to be talking about EPO. What is EPO? How does it make you faster? What increases EPO naturally? What type of training session is best? What components of the diet are important? Exogenous EPO. What is EPO? Erythropoietin, or EPO, is a hormone that is produced by the peritubular cells in the kidneys. After it's synthesized, it travels in the blood to bone marrow, which contains stem cells. These are cells that can turn into different types of blood cells. EPO binds to the EPO receptors on the cell surface. This protects the cell from cell death. Therefore, it can go on to differentiate into an erythrocyte, a red blood cell, resulting in a greater total number of red blood cells in the circulation, a higher hematocrit, meaning more of your blood is made up of red blood cells. Okay, great, you've got more red blood cells. How does this make you faster? There are a few ways this can increase performance. Here are some of the main ones. The first, and perhaps most obvious, is you will have greater oxygen delivery to the working muscle tissue. With the higher number of red blood cells, you will have a greater number of hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen and offloads it to the working muscle. Here the oxygen can be used by the mitochondria to help provide energy in the form of ATP. Although oxygen availability in the fibers is not always the limiting factor in performance. As exercise intensity increases, more CO2 and hydrogen ions are produced. This lowers the function of enzymes and mitochondria and also impairs the force of muscle contraction. However, more red blood cells means that CO2 and hydrogen ions can be carried away at a faster rate. Lactate production also increases as exercise intensity or fatigue increase. It will be transported out of fast twitch muscle fibers into the blood, where it is carried to slow twitch fibers, which can use it as a fuel. More red blood cells mean that more lactate can be transported to the slow twitch fibers at a faster rate. Red blood cells can decrease peripheral vascular resistance by releasing nitric oxide, which causes vasodilation of the blood vessels. Now you have a greater blood flow, and so the previous three benefits are increased even more. Apart from its mechanism of action in the bone marrow, there are also actions that EPO does directly that improve performance. For example, when traveling in the blood, it acts on red blood cells and protects them from destruction, resulting in more red blood cells in the circulation. EPO also plays a role in the protection of nerve cells against oxidative stress during the formation of new blood vessels. More capillarization means more blood flow, which means the previous benefits are all increased. How can you naturally cause an increase in EPO? Hypoxia is the main signal for the body to produce more EPO. Low arterial partial pressure of oxygen in renal blood stimulates the peritubular cells of the kidneys to increase EPO production. This can be achieved by sleeping or living and/or training at altitude. I won't go into more detail about altitude now because I want to do a separate video on that at some point. Exercise itself only causes a small decrease in arterial partial pressure of oxygen. Not enough that would cause the kidneys to increase EPO production. However, during exercise, the body will change the blood flow to different organs, allowing more blood to be sent to the working muscles. The kidney is one of the organs that receives a reduced blood flow via vasoconstriction, causing a decrease in the arterial partial pressure of oxygen and therefore stimulating EPO production. Every time you exercise, it contributes to the release of hormones such as noradrenaline, cortisol, and androgens, for example testosterone. These hormones can aid in the stimulation of the secretion of EPO from the kidney. Testosterone can also directly impact erythropoiesis by increasing the number of those EPO receptors we saw earlier, resulting in more EPO binding. What type of training session is best for an increase in EPO? The best session would be a ride that is long in duration but not at an easy intensity. The specifics, like duration and intensity, will vary greatly between athletes, but the main criteria for a ride to increase EPO production is one that you have not completed in the past, making sure you are progressively overloading. An example might be 60 minutes to 4 hours or even longer in highly trained athletes, with the power output ranging from 78 to 101% of best hour power, depending on the duration. Always use the minimum effective dose, allowing more room for progression and less chance of overtraining. Obviously, the body is a holistic system, so every micronutrient contributes to EPO production on some level. However, these are the ones that play a key role. I do want to do more in-depth videos about these nutrients at some point, so I will only briefly brush over them now. Remember, more is not always better. If you want to check you are low in these, then you should get a blood test. Folic acid and vitamin B12 play a crucial role in DNA synthesis. Therefore, deficiency of either of these vitamins greatly impacts the functions of any tissues with rapid cell turnover. For example, the bone marrow, which you'll remember from earlier is the site of erythropoiesis. Deficiency in either of these vitamins can cause megaloblastic macrocytic anemia.
That sounds mega. Sign me up.
Although the name might suggest it's mega, it is actually far from it. Your red blood cells would be abnormally large with an irregular shape and therefore have a lower hemoglobin carrying capacity. There would also be a lower total number of red blood cells that even make it out of the bone marrow and into the circulation. And the cells that do manage to do so will have a lower lifespan than normal healthy red blood cells. All of this results in a lower amount of oxygen in the blood. Iron is synonymous with the word blood, and for good reason. Iron is used by the body for the synthesis of hemoglobin. As mentioned earlier, hemoglobin in the red blood cells is what oxygen binds to be transported around the body. Now we know how EPO is beneficial to performance, it is easy to see why some athletes take it exogenously in order to gain an unfair advantage over their competitors. Epoetin is used clinically to treat a wide range of conditions, mostly patients with chronic renal failure. It comes in several different forms, with plasma half-lives ranging from 5 hours to 137 hours. It can be administered intravenously into the veins, subcutaneously into the fat just under the skin, intraperitoneally into the peritoneal cavity, or orally. Use of epoetin is not without its risks. Here are the common ones. Epoetin can cause fever and other influenza-like symptoms because it increases the production of two proteins, interleukin-1 beta and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These proteins are involved in the fighting of infections and the induction of fever. You will remember from earlier, iron is needed for the synthesis of hemoglobin. As epoetin increases the generation of red blood cells, the demand for iron will increase. If the body's iron stores cannot keep up with this demand, then it will cause iron deficiency. With the higher number of red blood cells, the hematocrit will be higher, meaning more of the blood is made up of red blood cells. Basically, the blood is so thick that it can increase the chances of types of venous thrombosis, both pulmonary embolism and deep vein thrombosis, and a lot of different cardiovascular diseases such as coronary heart disease. These can all result in death. Athletes potentially have more room to gain performance benefits when taking EPO before they reach the dangerous hematocrit value. This is because athletes usually have a lower than average hematocrit, not because they have a lower total number of red blood cells. They still have more than untrained individuals, but because they have a much higher blood plasma volume and therefore a lower ratio of red blood cells make up the blood, even though there are more of them. This means that athletes have a reduced blood viscosity. It's also common for athletes to have intravascular hemolysis, which is the destruction of red blood cells during exercise, which is more common in runners than cyclists. Hopefully you can see how this gives them more room to play with before blood becomes too viscous. You might now be worrying if you will get these side effects just from increasing your EPO naturally through diet, training and or altitude. If you aren't taking exogenous EPO, you don't need to worry about the side effects. It is impossible to reach that high of a blood viscosity without having some sort of disease such as secondary polycythemia. And as I've just mentioned, athletes have thinner blood, so you are at even less risk even though there is zero risk to begin with. As an athlete, you should be more concerned about your hematocrit getting too low than too high because of the higher plasma volume and intravascular hemolysis. Your body has many different negative feedback mechanisms in which it regulates EPO to prevent the overproduction of red blood cells. For example, that binding that was mentioned right at the start of the video signals to the cell to perform endocytosis, and then the lysosomes in the cell degrade the EPO molecule. This way, after it has performed its job, it is taken out of the circulation, preventing levels of circulating EPO from getting too high.